talked about it before the break with those COVID doomsday predictions. Well, let's get into them with my economics panel because we've got some interesting information for you. Joining me now, the Australian's Adam Crichton from Sydney, and from Melbourne, columnist for the Herald Weekly Times, Terry McCrann. Gentlemen, great to have you back for 2021. Adam, you started the year with a cracker. What I read on Monday or Tuesday, where you wrote about all of those wild COVID predictions. You mentioned a couple in your article. I've got to repeat them. Epidemiologist Tony Blakely forecast 134,000 would die without lockdowns. Economist Richard Holden, Bruce Preston assumed about 225,000, almost 1% of the population, would have died without our tough response. Nowhere near accurate. If they're like this on the numbers dead, you can't trust their economic work anywhere, can you?
Well, look, certainly those forecasts at the time I thought were completely ridiculous, and they did actually have, at least in the case of Professor Blakely, with lockdowns, he said something like 25,000 or 30,000 would die. So even in the lockdown scenario, they were wildly wrong. The problem is they just extrapolate from these mathematical models and they don't assume kind of any response in the population. I think now, kind of 1 year on, though, I think many people think, oh, well, look, if we hadn't have done anything, if we hadn't have locked down, if we didn't have our mask rules, then, we would have lost hundreds of thousands of people, which I think is, completely ridiculous. I think the reality is that, by virtue of where we are in the world, in Australia, our climate's different, where, our cities are less densely populated. I think these reasons probably explain why we have relatively few deaths compared to other countries, rather than, our 4 square metre rules or our mask mandates.
In the case of Victoria, though, Terry, I supported the lockdown after the government had stuffed things up so monumentally. We had infection rates of 700 a day, not because it was necessarily something you wanted to do at the start of the year. Certainly didn't support it then, but they'd lost complete control, and it was about the only way to slow things down in terms of the transmissibility of the disease, wasn't it?
Well, clearly, Peter, on the big picture, the most important thing we did was banning international arrivals, and particularly the arrivals from China at the end of February. That was the most important thing. I think if you look at the global situation, the countries that have done best are almost entirely countries that are islands, that can actually put a wall around their country. So that was the important thing.
We should have about 2020, and Adam's been leading it, is being... What is the price that we paid? Was it, what lives were saved by the lockdowns in the context of closing off those arrivals? Now, in the case of Victoria, as you say, once the virus broke out of quarantine, we gave away that big thing that we've done, which was keeping the virus out of the country. Some sort of lockdown was, I think, inevitable. We can have a debate about how long it took. It clearly had a big impact on the economy. Ironically, somewhat quixotically, the fact that Victoria was locked down in the September quarter meant that it's been a bit of a supercharger to the Australian economy in the December quarter. The big question, obviously, for 2021 is going to be how quickly the vaccine comes and how quickly it's effective in an economic sense.
I want to talk about JobKeeper. Just I want to move on. I'm sorry, Adam, I've got a lot to get through. A JobKeeper due to finish in March. There will be a movement down, we're told, in relation to the job seeker, which we know the dole was doubled at the time of the pandemic last year. Interestingly, I was down the coast in Victoria over the break. There were a number of pubs and restaurants that couldn't open 7 days a week. They had plenty of clientele. No one can go anywhere, can we? Can only holiday at home. Plenty of clientele, but they could not open because they couldn't get workers. Now, Adam, there's a big push. ACOS and others, they want this extended. Will it be extended? Do you think Josh Frydenberg will hold the line?
Well, look, he should hold the line, I think. After all, there's still 2 months at least of JobKeeper left, so that's enormous support. And let's hope that by the time April comes around, many of the restrictions have actually been lifted. And so, a 6-month extension, the likes of which was being asked for by the industry, I think that was always excessive. And it's also important too that that the government remembers that there's money isn't growing on trees. The increase in debt, kind of out over the next few years, is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So at some point we do have to to pause on the support. I think Australia's levels of support generally have been amongst the largest in the world across Western countries. So So there's already been a huge amount of support, and let's just hope that the economy bounces back strongly in April.
And what are we going to find in Victoria, Terry? You know, when that support goes, we know that 40% of the payments were for Victorians. There's worries there that there'll be an increase in unemployment, small businesses go to the wall, mortgages foreclosed on, or do you think we're through the worst of it now?
Well, as Adam says, we really have to see what happens when we get into April, what's happening with the economy, whether in fact the virus remains under control. Clearly, JobKeeper was the single most important thing we did in 2020 in terms of offsetting the impact of the lockdowns, keeping people in touch with their jobs and keeping those businesses alive. I agree absolutely with both Josh and Adam that we should end it as a general policy at the end of March. But maybe the Treasurer needs to, depending how circumstances evolve, and again, particularly in Victoria, maybe he needs to think about targeted relief going beyond March, but certainly not locking in anything like a 6-month commitment.
Terry, I've got to ask you, you've written about the whole issue of the Morrison government and Google and Facebook and this introduction of the proposed media bargaining code for them to pay for the news content that they use to drive eyeballs. You say this is a battle Australia can't afford to lose. Why?
Absolutely, Peter, because this goes far wider and far deeper than simply providing some revenue stream for publishers like News Corporation, like the 9 newspapers, and indeed like the ABC ultimately. This is about our fundamental sovereignty, because if we allow Google to become the gatekeeper, able to throttle what we see and what we read, and even indeed what we basically know about, we're handing over power to control our national life to Google, to the geeks behind Google, and to the algorithm that drives the search engine. And we've seen already, Peter, how companies like Google, like Amazon, kowtow to China in terms of censoring information. And this is an extremely dangerous reality that we really have to face up to. So we have to retain control of the gatekeepers for information flows, not so much entertainment, obviously, but information flows to all Australians.
And we can't forget the political persuasions and influences of some of those big tech giants too at the very top of these companies. Terry McCrann, Adam Crichton, thank you for your time. Welcome back to 2021. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.